Mugabe for president, but for how much longer? As the ruling party meets for its annual conference, Mugabe still eyes the presidency despite his age and failing health. But what about the problems that have continued to plague Zimbabwe? And is a change of leadership the answer? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Seeker. Well, the four-day conference in Bulawayo is expected to rubber stamp Robert Mugabe as a presidential candidate in Zimbabwe for 2012. The annual Zanu-PF conference kicked off on Thursday. Zimbabwe's economy and the proposal of putting a 51% controlling stake in foreign enterprises in the hands of Zimbabwean blacks is also on the agenda. But Mugabe has ruled Zimbabwe for 31 years now, much of it with an iron fist. And at 87 years old with ailing health, is it time for him to step down? And what does the future hold for the uneasy power-sharing alliance between Mugabe's Zanu-PF and his Prime Minister Morgan Tsvangirai's Movement for Democratic Change? Well, let's tell you a little bit more about Zanu-PF just before we get started. The Zimbabwe African Nation Union, the Patriotic Front, has been the ruling party since independence in 1980 with Robert Mugabe at its helm. It was formed in 1963 and known simply as ZANU, but was divided with the minority against violent struggle. The majority backed Mugabe's militant agenda. During independence elections in 1980, ZANU allied itself with the Zimbabwe African People's Party, or ZAPU, but split after they won the majority. Following 5 years of civil war, ZANU-PF gained complete control, absorbing any opposition. Well, joining us now to talk more about this are our three guests. In Pretoria, Matlotleng Matlu, Director of the Africa Institute of South Africa. In Johannesburg, we have Heidi Holland, a journalist and author of Dining with Mugabe. And on the line from Bulawayo, we have Alexander Kanengoni, author, broadcaster and political analyst. Good to have you all with us. Matlotleng Matlu, if I could start with you. Now, let's talk about this move for early elections first. What is the thinking behind this push for elections in 2012?
Well, I think we must remember that the global political agreement of 2008 actually made provision for elections in 24 months. So elections should actually have taken place around June 2010. Earlier on this year, during the SADC summit in South Africa, amongst others, Zanu-PF was pushing for elections this year. So in a sense, having the elections next year is not totally untoward. They're already late. But I think importantly is to note that one of the conditions for holding the elections was the revised constitution. This has not been finalized. So that presents a number of challenges. Of course, Zanu-PF has wrestled the Senate from the opposition last month. It won the elections in the Senate. So in terms of legislative processes, it has the upper hand there. And the opposition itself is divided. So in a sense, it might be a case of take the opportunity when it presents itself.
Is that a school of thought that you agree with, Alexander Kanengoni, in Bulawayo, the divisions within Zanu-PF, that this is perhaps a feeling that we have to take advantage of this while we can?
The global political arrangement that was agreed and entered into by the political parties in Zimbabwe were always intended to be a transitional mechanism and not an end in itself. And there would always be the elections at the end of his lifetime. And the lifetime of that GPA was 2 years. It was intended to end in 2010. And here we are, a year down after it had expired. And in all honesty, from a technical point of view, the arrangement has outlived its mandate, actually. So there has to be an election as quickly as possible. But then, of course, as the gentleman from South Africa was saying, there would be need, actually, to draft and come out with a constitution that is before going into elections. And that is the stage that we've got to. And And we hope that everyone is genuine and committed to the process of drafting that constitution. But we are seeing that there are some parties within the GPA who don't seem enthusiastic actually to complete the process of writing the constitution, and yet the outreach program where views from the public were solicited, it was done a long time ago. Their views have been put together, and what remains now is just to draft the constitution. But we observe some reluctance from some of our friends.
Heidi Holland, what sort of a sense do you get of the current political landscape in Zimbabwe? And more specifically, why has Mugabe managed to last this long? Is it partly because there's been no strong successor?
Well, it's partly that. I think it's also partly explained by the fact that Africa's traditional governance system is a kingship system. You know, you go out when you die. This idea of democracy, that you stay a few years and give way to somebody else, is very new in Africa. But also Mugabe is all about power. He himself actually isn't really interested in money. If you go into his office, as I did to interview him a couple of years ago, it's a very humble room. It's got no adornment. It's got a very old radio on which he listens to the cricket, because he's got a British persona, as you know. So I think Mugabe never had any intention of stepping down. This is why he hasn't chosen a successor. He'll go out in a box. Of course, he will die. Unfortunately, I don't think that'll make a huge amount of difference, because, in my view, Zanu-PF is so well entrenched that it won't give way to any major changes.
But I'm interested to know from you as well, Heidi Holland, as someone who, as you say, has interviewed him extensively. What is it that really, I mean, we're talking about someone here who is quite advanced in age, is not in the best of health. He's been in power for 3 decades now. I mean, what is there left for him to do from a personal standpoint? What is there that would still motivate him in 2011?
Well, he's a very narcissistic individual. Everything is about himself, and the fact that he's the president of Zimbabwe is hugely important to him. He doesn't want to be a pensioner or a retiree. I mean, you know, your question assumes that he's a sort of a rational person. He's not mad, as many people think he is, but he's completely absorbed in himself.
Matlotleng Matlu, how would you, I mean, we talked earlier at the top of the program about this uneasy relationship in this power sharing agreement between President Mugabe and his Prime Minister Morgan Tsvangirai. How would you characterize that relationship right now?
Look, I think it has been deteriorating, I mean, you know, from the time it came together anyway. President Mugabe took certain powers, you know, convening cabinet, for example, appointing ambassadors, other diplomats, governors. So I think in a sense, you know, the MDC has been given, you know, the showing the trappings of power, but it really doesn't have power. Zanu-PF largely controls that, even if they have, I mean, even if the MDCT has strategic ministries, like, for example, that of finance, where, for example, Zanu-PF blames them for having held back funds at a certain time, you know, for the constitutional process to take place, donors who did not release funds on time, and so on and so forth. In certain cases, I mean, you know, at one time we do remember, of course, that the MDC was boycotting cabinet, and, you know, permanent secretaries and others will be appointed. In the meantime, the military had said they were not going to salute or, you know, owe allegiance to the government of Morgan Tsvangirai. And then, of course, there have been personal issues, personal challenges, the loss of his wife, and then other personal issues which have been in the media. Right now, the breakup of the MDC. And that has been played upon, of course, by, you know, a long-standing liberation movement and political party like Zanu-PF. In certain cases, people talk about spies within the MDC, which means that you know, Zanu-PF kind of really knows the plans of the MDC in many cases. And certain permissions sometimes being refused for the Prime Minister to travel abroad or to undertake certain initiatives. Of course, also where SADC has been involved in the process in the region, Zanu-PF, where it has desired, has not necessarily agreed with certain issues, whether it was the Troika, or the organ, the issue of election monitors or observers. So to that extent, I think it's an uneasy relationship. It's a government of national unity, but really the power lies with Zanu-PF.
Alexander Kanangoni, you're speaking to us from a part of Zimbabwe where it's fair to say Robert Mugabe hasn't always enjoyed a great deal of unqualified support. But has life improved at all in Zimbabwe under this power-sharing agreement?
Yeah. Well, it must be admitted that before the institution of the global political agreement and the formation of the inclusive government, things had become quite difficult then. And then after the inclusive government was put in place, there was a change, for the better, in practically every sphere of life. It must be admitted. It cannot be denied that. But what I find rather interesting is of course the interest that the appointment of Robert Mugabe to be the candidate for Zanu-PF in the forthcoming elections has generated so much interest from outsiders. I find that interesting actually, because I would have believed his appointment, his election to be the candidate is a purely Zanu-PF thing, and if there is anybody to be bothered about, should be people within Zanu-PF and not those from outside.
Heidi Holland, there are, as two of our guests have been saying, a lot of tensions between the MDC and Mugabe's ruling party, and all of these stories of continued intimidation of opposition members and violence and so on. Do you expect that sort of pattern to continue over the coming months as we go into this expected election next year?
Oh, I think definitely. Zimbabwe has been ruled on violence for the last half century. Everything is done violently in Zimbabwe. Negotiations do take place, but as you can see from this bogus alliance between Mugabe and Morgan Tsvangirai, this is tactical. Mugabe is a master tactician in his own interests rather than the country's. So I don't think there's going to be any change. And actually, one of the things to bear in mind, which I always find really interesting, is the population of Zimbabwe is 12 million, of whom, let's say, half are under voting age. A quarter of that population, at least 3 million, live in the diaspora, which leaves actually only about 3 million people for Zanu-PF to control. So it's surprising they have to use so much violence. I think it's very telling.
Matt Lotling, Matlu in Pretoria, I want to ask you this because we talked about this at the top of the program, this issue of Zimbabwe's economy and the proposal of putting a 51% controlling stake in foreign enterprises in the hands of Zimbabwean blacks. This has always been one of Robert Mugabe's trump cards, if I can put it that way, of playing on this notion of exploitation, foreign exploitation at the expense of blacks in Zimbabwe. Is this something that you believe that he can still take advantage of?
Well, look, I think it is important, when discussing issues, particularly in countries like Zimbabwe and Southern Africa, to remember the history of this region and the fact that African people were dispossessed of their land, wealth, and that the Lancaster House Agreement from 1979, the British government had made promises that, commitments to assist, for example, in terms of land issues. So that's one thing that we must bear in mind, which when you discuss Zimbabwe, you can never discount also for us here in South Africa as well. Of course, in South Africa, government has put forward policies with regards to broad-based black economic empowerment. We've had challenges around that. There have been recent moves with regards to issues around fronting. I think we've seen similar challenges in countries like Malaysia, where these policies might have started with the Bumiputra and places like India for so-called Dalits and untouchables, in the United States as well, where black people are in the minority. So I don't think there's anything unique about Zimbabwe in that regard. I mean, there have been issues of indigenization and localization in many African countries. President Michael Sata in Zambia is also looking at some of these matters. I think it is important that the wealth of a country indeed must be used for the benefit of the people of the country. You go to China or any other country, Botswana, government has investments and has made sure that in the mining industry, it does have benefits from that. I think what will be important in Zimbabwe is to ensure that we don't have a situation like has happened, for example, with some of the land, claims that people get land more than one farm, the farms are not used properly. I think it puts a burden on Zimbabwe, but it also puts a burden on the region. I think Zimbabwe was one of the strongest economies after independence. They were doing very well in terms of food production and manufacturing, but that the economy has whittled down, and that's problematic. I think the issue about the Zimbabweans being in the diaspora, those who are skilled and are able to work, that's fine. But in a case like South Africa, there are many of them who might not be employed, and it therefore puts a burden on South Africa, a country where in the constitution of South Africa, it says everyone is entitled to health and a number of other human rights. So I think these are important things, and there has to be a regional discussion on some of these issues where things happen in a country but have impacts across borders. So I think the issue of indigenization in Zimbabwe, there's a ministry for that. We've got to make sure that people who are entrepreneurs, people who qualify for those benefits, get those benefits, and it is not given to cronies, or it is not given to people in political parties, the ruling parties. We have similar problems in South Africa where people talk about tenderpreneurs, and for example, right now the national government has had to intervene in a number of provinces, amongst them a province like Limpopo, where it is suggested that friends and family get a lot of tenders, are unable to provide services. People then protest in the streets with regards to service delivery issues. We don't want to see the same situation in Zimbabwe. We've seen challenges, for example, in the diamond mines, where it's purportedly the army has intervened over there, and these diamonds, which are state resources, are then appropriated by individuals.
All right, I want to get Alexander Kanengoni's perspective on this. Do you agree with some of what you've just heard there? I mean, it's a question of much of the economic wealth is there. It just has to be distributed in the right way.
I agree. I couldn't agree with it more, actually. That is fundamentally the underlying reason for indigenization, to try and spread the wealth in the country across the entire population. That is the way we understand it. I mean, personally, that is the way I've always understood it. And I want to believe that beginning with the land reform program, it is exactly what happened, actually. There were allegations that the land eventually ended up in the hands of cronies of Robert Mugabe, in the hands of influential people in government. But an independent research done by a professor from the UK, Professor Schools, vindicated Robert Mugabe, actually, that the majority of the people that benefited from the land reform program were indeed people who deserved the land in the first place. And I have no reason to believe that the economic, the indigenization program that is happening at the moment will follow exactly the same pattern, actually, where it's the ordinary person that will eventually benefit from the program. There is, for instance, last week, the industry it must be a part of the Delta Group beverages. It was the waiters who got 51%, and I cannot imagine a situation. I cannot imagine any better way or any way of doing it where the ordinary waiter suddenly becomes the shareholder. I've always believed that was his intention, the indigenization and the economic empowerment program.
Heidi Holland, we've talked a lot about the perceived cronyism and corruption under Robert Mugabe, and I know that as long as he remains in power. You don't have much confidence that any of that will change. But if someone other than Mugabe were to take over, like Morgan Tsvangirai, for example, does he offer a real alternative? Do you believe? I mean, because this is a country that has been dominated by endemic corruption for 3 decades now.
I think it's very bleak. Personally, I think Zimbabwe's future is very bleak in the medium term. I mean, this 51% indigenization seems to be part of the patronage system in terms of the research that I've done. Indeed, most of the time you don't even get to have any say in your 51% partner. It's somebody appointed by Zanu-PF, and I think that's outright theft. You know, this is a program designed to keep Zanu-PF in office. Of course, one agrees with redistributing wealth. We have a major problem in that regard in South Africa. But if you really want to destroy your business prospects and your foreign investment, this is the way to go.
Matlu, you agree with that?
Well, look, I think we've got to be practical on this matters. I think the three of us agree that we can't have a situation in which there isn't redistribution of wealth. And we've mentioned South Africa also in that equation. It's the how that is important. It's to ensure that there is rule of law. There's got to be ensuring, I mean, that there's a strengthened civil society in Zimbabwe, and also in the region to monitor these issues. I think that in South Africa, for example, we've also had challenges where people have gotten land back and have not properly made use of it, or it might be a failing of the land reform policy, that people were given land but no proper extension services, or people were not necessarily farmers. So indeed, you must make sure that people who are given these enterprises know something about business. There's some partnership. I mean, there could be mentoring, business programs of mentoring, people who are about to retire and stuff like that. The workers, those workers who have bought into that beverage factory, we've got to make sure. I mean, in Germany, you have workers' councils, workers sit with management to decide certain things in the motor industry and stuff like that. They decide to take pay cuts, decide on production with management. So if you can create a working relationship in which this is viable, we would certainly agree with that. I think that is what the test of this cake will be, in ensuring that it is properly thought out. There would be issues around compensation, deciding how are you going to compensate people, what is fair value. These will all be issues, and I'm sure in the Zimbabwean case, just like in the South African case, I think the argument has been, but where the indigenous people, the original people, when this wealth was taken or land was taken, to what extent were they compensated? In many cases, people will talk about people being given bottles of gin or being given mirrors. So how do you deal with those historical injustices? I think these are issues also which must be put on the table, because if you don't, and people then have to be compensated millions of rands or millions of dollars, it creates a bad taste in the mouth in the end. And this might be some of the challenges, for example, that in the South African case, the National Planning Commission speaks about a divided nation, and where we might not necessarily have a proper national vision going forward. How do you try and ensure that there's justice with this process, there's reconciliation with this process, there's proper reconstruction, and that nations can move forward?
That is going to have to be the last word, but we will, of course, be following all of the developments in Zimbabwe over the coming months. But I want to thank all three of our guests. In Pretoria, Matlotleng Matlu, Director of the Africa Institute of South Africa. In Johannesburg, Heidi Holland, journalist and author of Dining with Mugabe. And on the phone from Bulawayo, Alexander Kanengoni, author and broadcaster and political analyst. Thank you to all three of you for your time, and thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we'd love to get your feedback on this and any other story. You can email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.